What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time? Governor Baker, it's great to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Appreciate it.
We were talking briefly before I hit record about your daughter, and I read a story about her, actually, that since she lives far away from you now, that you actually send her a song every morning. Can you tell me more about that?
So I don't quite get it every morning, but it's pretty close to every morning. And it was something I started doing when she was in college. I obviously live in Massachusetts. She went to school in the Midwest. She now lives even farther west. And I started doing it mostly on my way to work. And it was just a way to say, because she was an hour behind me, right? So if I sent it to her first thing in the morning, for me, she would get it when she woke up. And it was just my way of saying, sort of thinking about you and I hope you have a great day, that kind of thing. And she liked it. And frankly, I've lived a lot longer than she has. And my musical, repertoire goes back to like the 50s. And so one of the things that was kind of interesting about it was a lot of the songs that I was sending her that were sort of my generation or even before my generation, a lot of them weren't familiar to her, and she liked it. And so I just kept doing it. And she was home one time for a holiday, and she was playing songs on the Alexa in the kitchen. And I looked at her and I said, "Honey, that's a really good playlist." And she said, "Dad, that's the one that you made. I've just been popping them onto Spotify ever since you started sending them to me." And at that point in time, they had 700 or 800 on it. And it's kind of become just something between us.
I
And
love it.
um, and it's really just my way of trying to stay in touch with somebody who doesn't live close to me anymore.
Yeah, I feel that love of a dad and a daughter, man. I know what that's like. Mine are a little younger, but I know those days are coming, so I can imagine you do everything you can to stay close. But I read that and had warm feelings. Speaking of being a kid of a politician, so I can't even imagine what it's like to have your dad as the governor of the state of Massachusetts. But you also grew up with a dad who worked in the Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan administrations, and your mom, I read that you said is a liberal Democrat. So I also heard about these dinner table conversations where they encouraged you and your brother or brothers to participate in the dialogue amongst them. And so I'm curious, what was it like growing up with parents who are on not opposite ends of the spectrum, because it sounds like there's some moderation there, but what was it like in your household growing up?
Well, my mom and dad were married happily for 60 years until my mom passed away a few years ago. Um, but they really never did vote for the same person. And election day was always kind of fun where, one of them would say, maybe I won't vote this year. And the other would say, well, maybe I won't vote either. And somehow they both find their way to the polls and have a big laugh about it at the end of the day. Um, the, the best part about it, from my point of view, was they were having a conversation, and the conversation was really about how they would try to get things accomplished. And how would you do that? How would you pay for it? How long do you think it would take? Da 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 da. And they both had a real interest in the policy space. My mom was very involved in a lot of local stuff, as well as my dad being involved in two federal administrations. And I had friends who would come over for dinner, and they would enjoy the back and forth until they got asked to participate. And then, of course, a lot of stage fright at that point. But I think for me, the big thing I got out of it, and the thing I've always carried with me, is there really is more than one way to think about a particular issue or a problem, and that's okay. And I think one of the things we have lost in many of our political arenas is the ability to appreciate the fact that there is more than one way. Sometimes there's, 4, 5, 6 different ways you could think about how to do something. And I just accept that as a fact of life, given the way I grew up. And I totally, my mother and father always used to say, that your receiver is more important than your transmitter.
Mm.
And people, you got two ears, use them. Listen, learn, and make decisions based on as much data and information as you can collect. You will make better decisions. And that was them talking to us, mostly just about life and growing up and making, personal decisions. But it's absolutely a rule that I believe you should be following if you're in any kind of leadership environment. People want to be heard, and people expect you to gather as much information as you possibly can, even the stuff you don't want to hear, and then make what you think is the best decision for your organization and the people who work in it and the people who are served by it.
I read in your book Results that the model your parents set led you to never approach this work thinking that one side or the other is evil or harbors bad intent. And I loved seeing this because this is the way I want it to be. And it seems like this is the way you are. And so it kind of bummed me out when I then read further that you're no longer going to be running, or you're not running again to be governor, because you're the exact type of person that should be representing us. That's ultimately what you are. You represent the people. And I love this mindset, but I feel like this is not the way it is anymore. That it almost is, you have to go to your side and then fight. And I don't like that element of it. What do you think about that? And is that a change you've experienced over your time in politics?
Well, I've worked I worked for two governors previously. I was in the cabinets of Bill Weld and Paul Cellucci, who were governor. Governor Weld was governor when Governor Cellucci was lieutenant governor, and then when Governor Weld left, Lieutenant Governor Cellucci became governor. So for 8 years, I worked for those two gentlemen, and then I went off and worked in the private sector and ended up running Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare before I came back, and ran for governor 3 times. Lost the first time, won the next two. So I've been sort of in and around the political arena, as a live participant at the state level for quite a while. And obviously, I know that my dad spent two terms in Washington when I was younger. What I would say is, um, the the game today is, I think, more complicated for a lot of reasons. But the biggest reason is the growth of social media and the ability for single issue people to hold political figures, to a nearly impossible standard by virtue of their ability to organize, raise money, and engage. And it's just made it's a much tougher space than it used to be because of some of those things. And you do get punished by the single issue people if you quote unquote make a deal with somebody on the other side. But they people still do make deals. Congress made all kinds of deals early on during the COVID crisis here in the U.S., many of which I think you know saved lives and saved economies and made it possible for the country to weather what was a very, very heavy storm for a much longer period of time than I think anybody expected it to be. I think the CHIPS Act, which Congress just passed recently, again, complicated, difficult, but eventually, on a bipartisan basis, they got it over the goal line. Do I wish they could come to agreement on other issues and do it without some of the hair raising sidebar stuff that goes on? Yeah, probably. Although I think in some ways the, the difficulty that they face is definitely different than the ones that my dad and the people he worked for faced, or than the folks that I worked with in the '90s faced. It's a much more complex arena, and it's been made more complex by a lot of the single issue folks that play in it.
It it seems like the people on the far right and far left, I don't think they're the majority, but they are the loudest. When I travel the country all over the place and speak with people in all states, and I feel like most of us, and I'd put myself in this camp, are probably somewhere in the middle, right? Like, in some things I agree with what a Republican would say, and some things I agree with a Democrat. Like, and I feel like you're that way as well, even though it's almost impossible to be like that now. And maybe that's why you're not going to continue. But that's the sense that I get. Is that the sense that you get as you travel your state and probably more broadly even the country?
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. I do think that most people are either center right or center left,
Right.
and they're not as loud or as organized as the people that are on the far left or the far right. And I say to people all the time that I think a big part of our success, both as an administration and politically, I mean, we've had a 70% plus favorability rating in Massachusetts for most of our 7 years, 7.5 years as an administration. But we have not been viewed by the far left or the far right as their cup of tea. But I do believe we are very much in line with where the vast majority of the voters of Massachusetts are on the issues of the day. And I think DC is a little different with respect to that because I mean, I'm right next to and surrounded by that so-called middle of the population because I live and work here, and so do they. DC is kind of um, it's a different kind of place because most of the people who work in government on the elected side there actually aren't from there, and they do for the most part live there and deal with all the folks who do, many of whom are there because they're there to represent a particular issue or a particular point of view. And I think that creates challenges that, um, especially in the social media world that everybody lives in now, are a heck of a lot more difficult to work your way through.
Is that partially why you don't want to continue as governor or even potentially run for president?
No, I look, I'm when I finish this year, that'll be 16 years in state government, 8 working for 2 previous governors and 8 of my own working for as governor of Massachusetts. I'm gonna turn 66 in November. Um, my kids are now in their late 20s and early 30s, and one is married. One has been dating the same girl for a very long time. I expect they're going to get married at some point. Um, Only one of our kids currently lives in Massachusetts. If I want to see the other two, I got to go out of state. I just, you know, I thought real hard about, and my running mate, my Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito, and I talked a lot about going for it on the third term. I think we thought we had a pretty good chance to win and a good relationship with the voters and plenty of things to work on. But I think for my wife and my kids, it was sort of like, geez, we'd really you'd be 70 by the time you finish this next term, and um, our lives are getting more complicated, we're getting older, and so are you, and we'd like you to be around more,
Do you
and that's just hard to argue with.
I agree, and I wonder though because the you mentioned about your approval rating and Morning Consult, the global enterprise technology company. That I saw a poll from them that you are ranked the most popular governor in the country at a 74% approval rating. That to me means this dude should run for president because and after I read it, I like just to be straight with you, like I did not follow a lot of your politics leading up to the conversations I had with your team before this, but to prepare, I read a ton, and all I kept thinking is this is exactly the type of person that should be leading our country, right? And so I even listened to a podcast with Anthony Gonzalez, a guy who lives here in Ohio, who played at Ohio State and in the NFL as a congressman, also leaving politics because, and he's very similar to you. He's more of a moderate Republican. And I thought, God, these two guys should be like running our country, but they're both leaving. And do you feel like this sense of almost a responsibility greater than yourself or your family for the country to say, I want to help us get on track? Or you say, I got to put my family first?
Oh, look, I'm a big believer you can't do these sorts of things without the support of your family. I mean, at the end of the day, um, knock on wood, my wife and I have been married for almost 35 years. Um, Meeting and marrying and growing up and raising kids with her has been the greatest gift I could have possibly gotten. And I certainly will try to find some way to continue to stay involved in this stuff. And it's a big we got we got 350 million people in this country. I'm sure there are people out there who could make the play in the space and be successful at it. And I don't know who those people are at the moment, but if I'll say one thing for the United States is it's been pretty good about reinventing itself when
Mhm.
it has to, time and time and time again. And I do believe that it will this time too. Um, I spend enough time dealing with people generally, not just here, but I mean, the governors get together 4 or 5 times a year, and then the Democratic governors and the Republican governors also get together another 4 or 5 times a year with each other. And there's a lot of really talented people in that community, and most of whom are, sort of more of what I would call the practical, pragmatic types, because as governors, you get measured on what you actually deliver on, not on
Yeah.
what you oppose.
Yeah.
And for the most part, delivering on things is is a little harder than scoring points. Um, and I think as a result, um, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the people who end up looking and sounding sort of like um, Congressman Gonzalez or Governor Baker are probably going to come out of that kind of sort of path.
You think
Um,
so?
yeah,
Oh, it doesn't feel like that though. It feels like those people are leaving, which bums me out. Like seriously.
I I'm telling you, the these arcs don't happen overnight.
Yeah.
And I feel pretty good that one way or another, people will figure this out.
Yeah.
I really do believe it.
So I'm fascinated by the process of putting together, like making a go at it, to run, let's say in your case for governor at the beginning. So you lost one and you've won twice. The campaigning, the fundraising, the traveling. And I read in your book again that as a Republican in a solidly Democratic Massachusetts, you said that you had mostly small campaign events initially. What can you take me back to the beginning as you're making a go of it, of what it was like to raise money and put together this campaign and actually do your best to try to win?
Well, the interesting thing is, running in 2010 and losing was actually a growth opportunity. I ran against an incumbent, Governor Deval Patrick, who is a masterful communicator and a really good candidate and a really good campaigner. And I remember on a number of occasions when I was running against him, thinking to myself, "Wow, this guy is he's really good at this." Uh, but the way it based, I mean, the biggest thing about campaigns, especially early on, is you have to think about it as like a long race. And I described it one time to somebody. I said, "This is literally like the way you should think about the professional baseball season." Okay, early on, spring training and that kind of stuff. No one's interested in this except the absolute hardcores. Okay, and it's going to stay that way for a long time. And if your team doesn't actually get into the mix and um, become part of the possible playoff contending community by August, it's probably never ever gonna the switch is never gonna flip, and all of a sudden you're gonna have big crowds and all kinds of people showing up to hear what you have to say. Now, if by the time you get to August or Labor Day, you are in a race and it is competitive, then a whole bunch of other people who really haven't checked in before will start to check in, and they will then pay attention kind of on through the fall, because that's typically kind of the way the baseball season works. If your team's out of it by Labor Day, good luck getting people's attention. And I would say the same thing about political campaigns. Now, the race that I ran in 2010 was a three-way. The state treasurer was a Democrat, ran as an independent. He was in office at that time as a Democrat. He ran as an independent. I ran as a Republican. As I say, Governor Patrick ran as a Democrat, and it was a pretty competitive race. I mean, we were all sort of in it, and so by the time we got to Labor Day, people did tune in and they did pay attention throughout the course of the rest of the race. But the first few months is lots of phone calls, lots of small group meetings in people's living rooms and backyards and kitchens, and just a ton of discipline about being willing to understand that this is a numbers game and that you got to make a lot of calls. You know, the old joke about sales, you got to kiss a lot of frogs. You just got to go there and you got to do it. And you can't get up in the morning and say, I don't want to do this today because you only got 24 hours and then it's going to be tomorrow. And, you know, I think in the first campaign, we did 1,000 events between, you know, sort of the beginning of the year. So it's been, you know, so January 2010 to election day in November. I think we did 1,000 events between sort of campaign events and fundraisers. And you know, and you learn a lot about your state. You learn a lot about the people who live in it. You learn a lot about what they care about. Um, but it's interesting. After I lost, I had a really interesting conversation. I went around and did something I don't think most people do. After I lost, I went and I talked to the reporters that covered the race. I talked to a lot of the sort of talking heads and the cognoscenti, the, you know, so-called wise guys and girls who are just part of the political community around here. And I just said to all of them, what'd you think of the race? What do you think I should have done differently? And those were very humiliating and difficult conversations because most people said you didn't run a good race, and here's why. Um, but the part that rung in my ears for years after that was one of my friends said, you know, Charlie, you spent too much time with your customers and not enough time with your prospects. And this is something that, you know, for any of your listeners who are interested in politics, or being a candidate, it's always easy to talk to your customers. It's always easy to talk to the people who agree with you. It's always easy to talk to the people who are going to nod their head and say, yeah, that's great. The hard part is talking to people um, who may not. And to understand, and so like the biggest thing I took out of that first race, based on all the conversations I had with people, is if you want this job, you really have to go out there and talk to a lot of people who may not agree with you, right? I'm going right back to where my mother and father always were. And so the second time I ran, I spent a lot of time campaigning in places where I was definitely not going to get 50% of the vote. But that wasn't the point. The point was to give those folks a chance to hear me and to be heard and to make the case that I was chasing 100% of the vote, not 51, not, you know, 52, but I wanted to hear from every opinion I could hear from. And you know what? It made me a way better candidate and it made me a way better governor. You know, talking to all those folks who had completely different points of view than mine, totally different life experiences. Um, it was a really good thing. And I've said many times that I don't think I would have won that race the second time if I hadn't spent that time learning and growing at the age of, you know, 50 something. Um, it made me a much better candidate and a better person, and it definitely made me a better governor.
What a great lesson for life in general. You know, you're spending
Totally.
too much time with the people, your customers, and not enough with your prospects, meaning the people who agree with you or disagree with you. I find too, you can meet up with somebody, you may be on different ends of any spectrum, but the more you talk and the more you kind of learn about their stories, you for the most part, you usually grow to like each other. At least I've experienced that. I wonder how it was for you. You seem to be such a likable guy who's a quality listener and curious and kind that when they just spend time with you, I could see you changing some minds over the course of a short period of time.
Well, you know, I have good personal working relationships with all kinds of people who have a variety of opinions. And I'll tell you this too. The other thing I would add is kind of a um, an addendum to your previous comment about people. If you actually spend time with people you don't necessarily agree with and get to know them and get to like them. The other thing I promise you is you will find things you agree on.
Yep.
I mean, this idea that everybody doesn't, that there are a lot of people out there who literally agree about nothing, it's just not true. But
Right.
people have stopped sort of like doing the engagement and finding out where the common ground is. If you look at some of the stuff that we've worked on in almost every area you can think of, healthcare, housing, education, transportation, you're going to find that there are absolutely common ground opportunities with people that I don't agree with on much of anything and don't agree with me on much of anything. But there are, in fact, over and over again, these areas you come across where it's like, yeah, I now you won't find those um, unless you really do sort of put aside the ego and some of the other win lose attitudes that people bring to this, and pay attention.
You mentioned earlier that you get together with the other governors, all the governors, and then sometimes just the Republican ones. Could you take us inside those rooms? Like, what are those meetings like? How do people interact with you being the quote most popular or the most highest approval rating of all of those governors? Like, what's it like inside those rooms?
The No one cares. Um,
Are they
Really, no
jealous?
one.
Are they saying
No,
like, "Oh, we don't like
no,
Charlie"?
no
No,
one cares. No one
you
cares.
don't care.
That's not why we're there. Okay. Um, we talk shop. I mean, we
Yeah,
talk family. But a lot of the time we talk shop. And and one of the best parts about being in a room with a bunch of your colleagues who have some of the same headaches and heartburn you have, is you can talk about some pretty combustible stuff. And some of the some of the most meaningful conversations I've had about some of the toughest issues that we deal with in government have come in, gatherings of 8 or 9 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 12. And sometimes it's just the govs, sometimes it's the governors and their spouses. Um, because people don't come to those conversations with, you know, a win-lose mentality. People are having those conversations because we're all playing to the best of our ability, a hand that's reasonably similar from state to state. There's like this huge commonality among governors, irrespective of what your ideology or your party is. And so, um, I've been some of these conversations go, deep into the night, where people are just sitting around talking about um, all kinds of things. And I'll tell you this: during the pandemic, um, we had lots and lots of phone calls.
yeah.
Some of which no set agenda. You didn't necessarily know who was on the phone. It was just like a therapy session, and governors would get on there and just talk about what was up and what was going on in their states, and how they were working their way through some of the constantly changing footprint with respect to data and information and availability of things, and how you handling the issues around safety and how are you defining safety and how you deal with the mental health issues and the isolation. And I mean, there's really nobody else who's sitting in the same chair, right?
Yep.
So it's a tremendous opportunity to talk to somebody who lies awake thinking about the same things you're thinking about.
Speaking of that chair, there's I can imagine like you've acquired an immense amount of power. All of the governors had have. How do you manage not letting your ego get out of control or getting a big head because of all of the power that you now have?
So I tell people all the time that this is the most humbling job I've ever had. All right. I mean, if if anybody tells you that they feel smarter and bigger and better as a result of their experience in this job, they really weren't paying attention, because um, this is a job where you are constantly reminded of what you didn't get right. which, which is fine. I understand that and I get it. Um, but I also believe that, you know, I constantly have this conversation, especially with people in the media, about, you know, how do you define success? And uh, and my view on it all along has been state government. I mean, I have 250 agencies, 40,000 employees, about 15 or 20 independent authorities that all sit somewhere in my jurisdiction, and with an incredibly vast array of things they do, services they provide, dollars they spend, programs they support. Um, and the thing I've always said is, look, what people really want is demonstration that you understand there's a problem when there is one, that you will be as straight as you can be with them about what you're going to try to do to solve it. And then if you aren't getting it right, you will pivot and try something else to try to get it right. And that you won't, you know, you won't mislead, misrepresent, underrepresent, understate, or dissemble. And um, either with the people or the people you work with, right? I mean, the people you work with also need to know um, that you're going to do the best you can to understand whatever it is the problem is they're trying to solve, and try and be helpful wherever you can. And I think for a lot of the tendency for a lot of folks in life generally is to minimize the stuff that's not working and to try to talk your way out of it. Um, I'm more of the mind, given what I saw with my mother and father. If something's not working, acknowledge it's not working and try to come up with something better.
How much did your time as a CEO in the private sector help you as the governor of Massachusetts?
Well, I think it helped a lot in a number of ways. I mean, you can't exactly run government like a business for a bunch of very good reasons. In business, you get to pick most of the people you work with. In government, you don't. In business, you can pick your strategy, you can pick what you choose to focus on, you can pick your organizational structure. Um, for me as governor, most of that stuff, I can make proposals to the legislature, but at the end of the day, the legislature is going to tell me how much I get to spend, what my organizational structure looks like, and in some respects, what my priorities are going to be. And you play under such a bright light in the public sector. I mean, every decision you make gets challenged, and the whole debate about direction and strategy never ends. It's always going on. Whereas in the private sector, you can say, look, we're going to go. This is where we think our opportunity is, and then you go for it. And it's the way I described it to somebody one time, as I said, it's much easier to get every oar in the boat going in the same direction in the private sector than it is in government. Government's almost designed to not have every oar go in the same direction. It's supposed to be a constant back and forth to make a decision about how you're going to get where you're going, which makes it a lot messier. Um, but I think the opportunity to create a framework around metrics um, and to follow facts and to figure out what's really going on with a particular operation that's problematic, and then building a plan to deal with it, and then helping people figure out how you're going to measure whether or not you're succeeding, and then being willing, if you're not getting what you want, to change and to pivot. Um, the That's probably the biggest lesson of all, which is in the private sector. Um, if you don't change and pivot, if something's not working, you go away, right? And that is a lesson that a lot of folks in the private sector learn the hard way. And I definitely brought that into this job, which is if we're not heading in the right direction, we will change
Hmm.
um, because A, we owe it to the voters and to the people we work with, but B, um, not changing when you get into those circumstances is dramatically worse than actually taking the heat and changing the way you're doing something.
One of the decisions that you were able to make, I want to go back to the fall of 2014. You're struggling to find a Secretary of Transportation. Again, I read about this in your book, Results, which I highly recommend people read. You said, and I like this. I'm going to steal this. You said you're looking for a 50% player, someone who thought you had real issues and wasn't interested in making things just 5% better, but dramatically better. And a friend recommended you to a woman named Stephanie Pollock. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yep.
Well known, respected liberal Democrat. Remember, you are Republican. Uh, can you tell me what happened next?
So, yeah, I talked to a number of people who basically told me that they thought things were working fine and we just needed to do a few things, tweak a few things. And I didn't see it that way. I saw it as a much bigger problem. Um, and this friend of mine said I should talk to Stephanie. And I said, you know, when I worked in the Weld administration, I think she sued us like 10 times when she was the chief attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation. Um, and my friend said, no, you should meet her. You'll like her. So she shows up. Both of us later on said we thought it was going to be like a 10-minute, hey, how are you? We don't agree about anything. Have a nice day conversation. And, you know, within 15 or 20 minutes of starting to talk to her, I stopped thinking I was there to be sold and started thinking I was in sell mode. I mean, she was saying a lot of the things about what I thought was wrong that needed to be addressed, and I identified, addressed, and dealt with. Um, and we talked for about an hour and a half. And when she was leaving, I said, you know, you still need to meet the Lieutenant Governor, Karen Polito, and the guy who's coming in as chief of staff, but I really enjoyed this, and I really hope we can end up working together. And if we do, you know, most of my friends are never going to speak to me again. And Stephanie looked at me and basically said, "Yeah, and if I take this job, none of my friends are going to speak to me again either." Now, eventually, she did come to work for us and did a lot of the work that she and I talked about that first time we got together. And she is now the number two person at the Federal Transportation Administration in DC in the Biden administration. So um, I, and that was a huge, I mean, that was a huge surprise. That was not somebody who ever would have been on my list. But I've met a lot of people over my career um, who never would have been on my list, so called, who ended up being really important to the success of organizations I've been involved with.
Much like the co-author and your first chief of staff, right? Steve
Yeah,
Cage, who is
exactly.
a lifelong Democrat. Can you share more about that relationship and how is that odd for a Republican to have a lifelong Democrat as his chief of staff?
So Steve and I met in 1991 when I came in as at Health and Human Services in the Weldon Salucci administration. He was working in state government at the time, and one of the things we wanted to do was to consolidate our state hospital system, the publicly operated state hospital system, which was, you know, built for a completely different time, had tons and tons of empty beds, needed hundreds of millions of dollars in renovations if you're going to keep running it, and was just, you know, totally past its prime. And Steve was somebody who believed, as a liberal Democrat, that this thing was no longer the operating model that made sense for people with developmental disabilities, mental health issues, and in some cases public health issues as well. And he saw a big opportunity to consolidate the system, save money, and take the savings and put it into community-based programming, which is really where people were going. Um, and that's how we met. And he and I worked together on this task force, which had a bunch of different representatives from a variety of points of view. We eventually issued a report that we gave to the governor, and then we implemented it. And he was part of the team that worked on this report, as was I. I was the lead person on it for the administration, and we implemented the entire thing. We saved about $60 million and turned around and put that 60 million into community-based programs in public health, mental health, and developmental disabilities. And then he came to work for me when I became administration and finance secretary. He came over and was the guy who oversaw what I would describe as administration and operations. And we rewrote the way the state purchased goods and services and prepared for Y2K. Remember Y2K?
I do.
Um, and Steve put together the whole program plan for that. And then he went off to be the number two guy at UMass Medical Center. And when I got the job, at Harvard Pilgrim, which was in terrible shape, on its way to bankruptcy and receivership. I called him up and I said, "I'd really like you to come work on this, and it's going to be hard, and it may not succeed, but I want to do it with the best people I know." And so I gathered a whole group of people that I'd worked with over the years. It was a total A team, and they all came, which was pretty amazing because it was a nonprofit. It wasn't like you were going to get a big stock bonus if we actually pulled off the turnaround. And they came, and we did. And skin of our teeth and hair raising days and months. But Harvard Pilgrim went from receivership to out of receivership, to within 3 years, the highest ranked health plan in the country for member satisfaction and clinical effectiveness. We grew the membership by 40% and completely um, um, recovered all of the lost um, sort of surplus, which is what you call it in a nonprofit, um, to return the place to financial, operational, and clinical excellence over the course of the time we were there. And Steve was a huge part of that whole thing. And then he went off to do something else, and I went off to do something else. And he was a little in. I mean, he had a fund. He and his wife had a fundraiser for me when I ran in 2014. Um, which was, a room full of Democrats with Steve and his wife telling all their Democratic friends why they should support this Republican who was running for governor. And Steve basically pitched it by saying, "Look, I've known this guy." At that point, he'd known me for 25 years. And he said, "I've worked with this guy 3 times, and he is the kind of person who we should all want to see in a role like this."
Mm.
And when I won, he was the first person I called, and all these people were like, "This guy didn't even work on your campaign. He's a Democrat. What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm picking the guy who I think will bring us the best opportunity to be successful at delivering on our agenda, among other things, to improve the quality and performance of state government and state services." Um, and I trust him implicitly, and I believe he's the right person for the role. And it was really odd for somebody to pick somebody who didn't work on the campaign, who wasn't registered in the same party, um, but it made perfect sense to me.
Mm. I love it. Yeah, and ultimately, you guys got results, which is again the title of your book. I have one more question, Governor. Maybe this is for people that are around some of your kids' age, and that is maybe a recent college grad, early to mid 20s. What are some general pieces of life slash career advice you'd give to them?
Well, the biggest thing would be to work with people who you can learn from. I've had a bunch of spectacular mentors over the course of my career, some of whom were peers and colleagues, and some of whom were bosses, and some of whom were customers. But I'm a huge believer that work is about growth fundamentally. I don't think it's about money. I mean, I spent a big piece of my career in the nonprofit and public sector, as well as time in the private sector, the for-profit private sector. I've enjoyed it, all of it. But for me, the most important thing has always been to try to end up in roles and positions where I can learn from the job and the work I'm doing, and learn from the people I'm working with. And to me, that's kind of point number one. Point number two would be, you will go through, no matter what you choose to do, some really awful, ugly times if you try to do anything meaningful or worthwhile. You should grit your teeth, put your head down, and get it done. Do not run, do not cry, do not complain. Do the work. You will learn so much from it about yourself and about the people you work with if you do that. And the third thing I would say is, be honest and true to yourself. The that's much harder to do than it is to say, but we all have a gyroscope, right, that spins inside our soul, our body, however you want to think about it, and we know when it's spinning the right way, and when it is, work work is not that hard. Um, you know, I put in an enormous amount of hours in every job I've had, but and it's work and it's hard, um, but the growth and the learning opportunity that comes with it, just completely makes up for the rest of it. And I've said, many people say to me all the time, this job must be exhausting, and it is, but it's also exhilarating, and it's
Mm.
also an incredible education, um, and I'm blessed to have the opportunity to do it. But those would be my sort of three big messages for anybody starting out.
I love it. The book's called Results: Getting Beyond Politics to Get Important Work Done, which is obviously what you have done throughout your career. Governor Charlie Baker, man, I really appreciate you being here. And I would love to continue our dialogue as we both progress. I'm excited to see what you do next. And I'd love to have another conversation if you'd be open to it.
I'd be happy to anytime, Ryan. As you
Thank you.
know, I'm a big fan of Ohio.
Thank you. I appreciate it, man. Good talking with you.
Okay, take care.